I never thought the worst betrayal of my life would come from someone I'd welcomed into my family with open arms. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and I'm 63 years old. I've lived through a husband's death, raised 2 daughters on a teacher's salary, and survived breast cancer twice. I thought I'd seen the worst life could throw at me. I was wrong. If you've ever been disrespected by someone you trusted, someone you fed at your own table, then you'll understand the white-hot rage that consumed me that September afternoon. And if you're watching this from somewhere in the world right now, leave a comment telling me where you're from, because what happened to me could happen to anyone, anywhere. This story isn't just mine. It's about dignity, respect, and what happens when someone mistakes your kindness for weakness. Before I tell you what I did, let me tell you what he did to me. Let me tell you how a man I'd known for only 3 years managed to awaken something in me I didn't know existed, a capacity for calculated revenge that would leave him broken in ways he never saw coming. But here's the thing about revenge. It's not always about getting even. Sometimes it's about teaching someone a lesson so profound, so devastating, that they'll spend the rest of their life thinking about the moment they crossed the wrong person. And before I go any further, I need you to do something for me. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever felt invisible or dismissed because of your age, hit that subscribe button. There are more stories like this waiting for you in the description box below, stories about people who refuse to be pushed aside. Trust me, you'll want to hear them. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. It was my daughter Catherine's 35th birthday party. She'd married Brandon Mitchell 2 years prior, a sleek, ambitious corporate attorney who wore his success like cologne, overpowering and impossible to ignore. From the moment Catherine brought him home, I'd sensed something off about him, something rehearsed in the way he smiled, the way he asked me questions about my life without ever really listening to the answers. But Catherine was in love. Deeply, desperately in love. And who was I to stand in the way of my daughter's happiness? I'd lost my husband, Daniel, when the girls were just teenagers, a heart attack that came without warning on a Tuesday morning while he was mowing the lawn. I'd spent the next 20 years making sure my daughters had everything they needed, even when it meant I had nothing left for myself. So when Catherine said she'd found the one, I pushed my instincts down deep and welcomed Brandon into our family. I showed up for every dinner, every holiday, every celebration. I bought them a KitchenAid mixer for their wedding. I babysat their golden retriever, Murphy, whenever they traveled. I was the mother-in-law who tried too hard because I wanted so badly for my daughter to have the happiness I'd lost. The party was at their townhouse in suburban Connecticut, one of those modern places with too much glass and not enough warmth. Catherine had invited about 30 people, Brandon's colleagues, some of her friends from her marketing firm, my younger daughter Jessica and her family, and a handful of neighbors. I'd driven 3 hours from upstate New York, where I still lived in the house Daniel and I had bought in 1987. I'd chosen my outfit carefully that morning, a lavender cardigan my sister had given me for Christmas, a simple floral dress I'd found at a consignment shop, and the pearl earrings Daniel had given me on our 20th anniversary. I thought I looked nice. Presentable. Like a woman who'd made an effort. I arrived early to help Catherine set up. She was in the kitchen, arranging cheese on a cutting board, her auburn hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked radiant, happy, and for a moment I felt that warm glow of maternal pride that never quite goes away, no matter how old your children get. "Mom, you didn't have to come so early," she said, but she was smiling. "I wanted to help," I told her. "It's your birthday. You shouldn't have to do all this alone." Brandon was upstairs getting ready. I could hear him on a phone call, his voice carrying down through the open loft. Numbers, percentages, someone named Trevor who'd dropped the ball on the Morrison account. He always seemed to be on a call, even during family gatherings. Especially during family gatherings. People started arriving around 6. I made myself useful, refilling drinks, taking coats, making small talk with strangers who barely glanced my way before moving on to someone more interesting. I was used to it, the invisibility that comes with being an older woman at a party full of young professionals. You become part of the furniture, pleasant and forgettable. Around 7 o'clock, after Catherine had blown out her candles and everyone had sung off key, Brandon gathered a small group of his work friends in the living room. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes that didn't need to be washed yet, when I heard his voice rise above the ambient chatter. "Yeah, my mother-in-law's here," he was saying. "You can't miss her, she's the one dressed like she raided a museum gift shop." Laughter. Multiple voices joining in. I froze, my hands submerged in soapy water, a wine glass suspended between my fingers. Seriously though, Brandon continued, and I could hear the smirk in his voice, Catherine's always asking why I don't want her mom staying with us more often. I mean, look at her. The woman looks like a relic. Like something you'd find in your grandmother's attic and donate to Goodwill. More laughter. Someone, a woman, said something I couldn't quite hear, but the tone was agreeable, conspiratorial. I'm just saying, Brandon went on, there's a reason my mom still looks good at 60. She takes care of herself. Gets her hair done. Dresses like she's still part of the world. But Eleanor? It's like she gave up in 1995. The wine glass slipped from my hand and shattered in the sink. The noise cut through the conversation. I heard movement, footsteps, but I couldn't turn around. I stood there, staring at the broken glass, at the blood beginning to bloom in the water from a cut on my palm I couldn't feel yet. Catherine appeared at my side. Mom? Are you okay? I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw that she'd heard it too. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and guilty, and in that moment I knew this wasn't the first time Brandon had said something like this. It was just the first time he'd been careless enough to let me hear it. I'm fine, I said. My voice sounded strange, distant. I just need a bandage. Let me help. I said I'm fine, Catherine. I wrapped my hand in a dish towel and walked to the bathroom, closing the door behind me. I sat on the edge of the tub and let myself shake. I didn't cry, the tears would come later, in my car on the long drive home, where no one could see them. But in that moment, I just shook. Because it wasn't just the words. It was the casual cruelty of them. The way he'd laughed. The way his friends had laughed with him. The way he'd reduced me, a woman who'd survived loss and illness and decades of struggle, to a punchline at my own daughter's birthday party. I'd worn these clothes because they were comfortable. Because they were mine. Because after years of buying everything secondhand and stretching every dollar to make sure my daughters had what they needed, I'd finally reached a point where I could choose things that made me happy, even if they weren't fashionable or expensive or impressive to men like Brandon Mitchell. But in his eyes, that made me pathetic. Laughable. A relic. I bandaged my hand and looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. I saw a woman with grey-streaked hair she'd stopped dyeing because the chemicals made her sick during chemo. I saw lines around my eyes that came from years of smiling even when I wanted to scream. I saw a body that had carried 2 children and survived 2 rounds of cancer and buried a husband and still got up every morning to face whatever came next. And I decided, right there in that bathroom with my hand throbbing and my daughter's laughter carrying through the walls, that Brandon Mitchell had made the biggest mistake of his life. I just didn't know yet exactly what I was going to do about it. I stayed for another hour. I smiled. I helped clean up. I kissed Catherine goodbye and told her I'd had a lovely time. Brandon didn't acknowledge me as I left, too busy regaling his audience with some story about a courtroom victory. On the drive home, the tears finally came. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of rage, pure, crystalline, clarifying rage. And somewhere around the New York border, as the sun set behind the mountains and the highway stretched empty before me, I started planning. If Brandon Mitchell wanted to see me as a relic, then I'd show him exactly what kind of damage a relic could do. The week after Catherine's party, I couldn't stop replaying that moment. His voice. The laughter. The casual cruelty of it all. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning, staring at my bedroom ceiling, and hear him saying relic over and over again. But here's what I learned about revenge in those sleepless nights. It only works if you understand your target completely. Rage makes you reckless. Knowledge makes you dangerous. So I started studying Brandon Mitchell like he was a dissertation I needed to defend. I'd always paid attention to him, of course. You do that when someone marries your daughter. But I'd been paying attention the way you watch a movie you're not particularly interested in, catching the major plot points while missing the subtle details. Now I needed to see everything. Every weakness. Every insecurity. Every crack in that polished facade he wore so effortlessly. The first thing I did was call my younger daughter, Jessica. She lived in Boston with her husband, Paul, and their 2 kids. Jessica had always been the more perceptive of my daughters, the one who saw through people's performances. Catherine led with her heart, Jessica led with her head. "Mom, I've been waiting for you to call," Jessica said when she picked up. "I heard what happened at the party," Catherine told me. "What exactly did she tell you?" There was a pause. "That Brandon made a joke about your outfit and you overheard. She feels terrible." A joke. That's what they were calling it now. A joke. Did she tell you what he actually said? Not word for word. But Mom, I know Brandon. I've known since the wedding that his. She trailed off, searching for the right word. Go ahead, I said. Say it. He's a narcissist. A textbook one. Everything's about image with him. Catherine's an accessory, not a partner. And anyone who doesn't serve his narrative gets dismissed or mocked or ignored. Hearing Jessica confirm what I'd instinctively felt for years should have made me feel better. It didn't. It just made me angrier that my daughter had married someone so fundamentally broken. Tell me everything you know about him, I said. And I mean everything. Over the next hour, Jessica painted a picture of Brandon Mitchell that was even uglier than I'd imagined. She told me about Christmas dinner 2 years ago, when he'd criticized the wine Paul brought, explaining in excruciating detail why a real wine enthusiast would never choose that particular vintage. She told me about the time he'd corrected Catherine's story at a family gathering, making her look foolish in front of everyone. She told me about his obsession with status symbols, the right car, the right watch, the right zip code. The thing about Brandon, Jessica said, is that he's terrified of being ordinary. His whole identity is built on being better than everyone else. Smarter, richer, more successful. That's why he married Catherine, honestly. She's beautiful and accomplished and comes from a good family. Us, even though we're not wealthy. We gave him legitimacy. A foundation story he could tell at dinner parties. And where does he come from? I asked. I realize I don't actually know much about his background. Because he doesn't talk about it, Jessica said. I did some digging after the wedding. Don't look at me like that, I was curious. His dad was a factory worker in Ohio. Laid off during the recession in 2008. His mom worked retail. They struggled. Brandon got out on a scholarship to a state school, worked his way through, graduated top of his class, got into a decent law school. The whole thing's a classic bootstrap story. So why hide it? Because it doesn't fit the image. He's not self-made anymore in his mind, he's always been elite. That's the story he tells himself and everyone else. His past is a threat to his present. I wrote all of this down in a notebook I'd bought specifically for this purpose. Brandon Mitchell, a man so desperate to prove he wasn't ordinary that he'd built his entire life around an illusion of effortless superiority. A man whose confidence was actually a carefully constructed defense mechanism against the shame of his origins. A man who'd made the critical error of underestimating someone he'd decided didn't matter. The second thing I did was start watching his social media. I'd never been particularly active online. I had a modest account where I posted pictures of my garden and my grandkids, but Brandon was everywhere. LinkedIn, where he posted insufferable motivational content about winning and success mindsets. A public profile on another platform where he shared photos of client dinners, expensive watches, trips to wine country. Every post was carefully curated. Every image was designed to project success. But the comments told a different story. They were sparse. Generic. The kind of engagement you get from people who feel obligated to like your content but don't actually care about you. For all his posturing, Brandon Mitchell was lonely. Isolated. Surrounded by colleagues and clients but not friends. Not real ones, anyway. I spent hours scrolling through years of posts, and I started noticing patterns. He name-dropped constantly, always mentioning the senior partners he worked with, the high-profile clients he represented, the exclusive events he attended. But he never tagged anyone. Never had anyone tag him. He was always at these impressive places, doing these impressive things, but somehow always alone in the photos. The more I looked, the more I saw a man whose entire sense of self-worth was dependent on external validation. On being seen as successful. On being envied. And that's when I understood exactly how to hurt him. The third thing I did was reach out to an old friend, Patricia Donnelly, who taught at the same high school I had before we both retired. Patricia's daughter, Michelle, was a journalist who'd made a name for herself covering white-collar crime and corporate malfeasance. I didn't tell Patricia what I was planning. I just asked if Michelle might be able to look into something for me as a favor. What kind of something? Patricia asked over coffee at our usual diner. I need to know if someone's who they say they are, I told her. Professionally, I mean. If their career is as impressive as they claim. Patricia studied me over her reading glasses. We'd known each other for 30 years. She could tell when I was hiding something. This is about Brandon, isn't it? She said quietly. I didn't answer directly. Can Michelle help me or not? Patricia sighed. I'll ask. But Eleanor, whatever you're thinking of doing, be careful. Men like Brandon don't take humiliation well. I'm counting on it, I said. Within a week, Michelle had sent me a detailed breakdown of Brandon's career. And here's what I learned. He was good at his job, no question. He'd won cases. He'd made money for his firm. But he wasn't the superstar he presented himself as. He was middle tier at best, competent, hardworking, but not exceptional. The senior partner track he constantly alluded to on social media? He'd been passed over twice in the past 3 years. The high-profile clients. Mostly mid-level corporate disputes, nothing that would make headlines. Brandon Mitchell had built his entire identity on a resume he'd inflated and a future he'd promised himself but hadn't actually achieved. He was living in constant fear that someone would notice the gap between his reality and his image. And now I knew. Now I had the ammunition I needed. But I didn't want to just expose him. Anyone could do that with a few phone calls or a well-placed email. That wasn't revenge. That was gossip. I wanted something more profound. I wanted him to understand, viscerally and permanently, what it felt like to be dismissed and diminished and treated like you didn't matter. I wanted him to feel exactly what he'd made me feel. The fourth thing I did was the hardest. I had to make peace with the fact that Catherine might get hurt in the process. I didn't want that. I'd spent my entire adult life protecting my daughters from pain. But I also knew that Catherine was already being hurt by Brandon. Slowly, incrementally, in ways she'd normalized because the damage was so gradual. She deserved better than a husband who mocked her mother at parties. Better than a man who saw people as props in his performance. And if my plan worked, she'd eventually see that too. But first, I needed to set the stage. I called Catherine 2 weeks after her birthday and asked if I could take her and Brandon to dinner the following month. Somewhere nice, my treat. I told her I wanted to apologize for leaving the party early, that I'd been feeling unwell and hadn't wanted to make a fuss. She sounded relieved, almost pathetically grateful that I wasn't angry. Mom, you don't have to apologize. And you definitely don't need to take us to dinner. Brandon should be apologizing to you. Has he? I asked. Silence. I didn't think so, I said gently. But that's okay. I'd still like to do this. It's important to me. She agreed. We set a date, October 15th, at an upscale steakhouse Brandon had mentioned wanting to try. The kind of place where being seen mattered as much as the food. The kind of place where Brandon would feel important. Perfect. I spent the next 3 weeks preparing. I bought a new outfit, not expensive, but carefully chosen. Elegant. Age-appropriate but polished. I got my hair done for the first time in years, adding some lowlight to soften the grey. I bought new glasses with frames that actually suited my face. I even splurged on a manicure. When I looked at myself in the mirror the morning of the dinner, I saw a woman who looked put together. Confident. Like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Because I did. I'd spent a month studying my target, understanding his weaknesses, and planning my approach. And now it was time to begin. Brandon Mitchell thought he'd mocked a harmless old woman. He had no idea he'd awakened something far more dangerous. A woman with nothing left to lose and all the time in the world to make him pay. The steakhouse was exactly the kind of place Brandon would love, all dark wood and leather, with lighting so dim you could barely read the menu without squinting. The kind of place where the waiters wore vests and introduced themselves with rehearsed friendliness, where the wine list was leather-bound and unnecessarily complicated, where every table felt like a stage for people performing affluence. I arrived first. I'd planned it that way. I wanted to be settled, composed, in control when they walked in. I'd worn a navy dress, simple, well-cut, the kind of thing you'd see on a woman who understood elegance didn't require shouting. My hair was styled. My makeup was subtle but deliberate. I looked like someone who belonged in a place like this. When Catherine and Brandon walked in, I watched his face carefully. I saw the moment he registered me, saw the slight double-take, the flicker of something, surprise? Confusion? Before his expression smoothed into his usual confident smile. Eleanor, he said, using my first name like we were peers, like he hadn't called me a relic 4 weeks ago. You look nice. Really nice. Thank you, Brandon, I said warmly, rising to kiss Catherine's cheek. You both look wonderful. Catherine did look wonderful. She always did. But there was something tired around her eyes, something tight in her smile. I wondered what life with Brandon was like when there wasn't an audience. What criticisms he leveled at her in private, what casual cruelties he disguised as jokes. We settled into our seats. I'd already ordered a bottle of wine, nothing extravagant, but something nice enough to show I'd made an effort. The waiter poured, and I raised my glass. To Catherine, I said. I know we already celebrated your birthday, but I wanted to do something special, just the three of us. Thank you both for making time. Brandon raised his glass with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was still trying to figure out what was happening, why I'd gone from the woman he'd mocked to this polished version sitting across from him. Good. Uncertainty was exactly what I wanted. We made small talk while we looked at menus. Brandon dominated the conversation, as always, talking about a case he'd won, a junior associate who'd completely botched some research, his thoughts on the firm's new management structure. I listened attentively, asked questions, laughed at appropriate moments. I was the perfect dinner companion, interested but not intrusive, engaged but not demanding. Catherine watched me carefully. She could tell something was different, but she couldn't pinpoint what. Every so often, her eyes would flick between Brandon and me, like she was waiting for something to explode. Nothing did. Everything was perfectly pleasant. When our food arrived, fillet for Brandon, salmon for Catherine, a modest chicken dish for me, I turned the conversation gently toward Brandon's background. You know, Brandon, I realized recently that I don't know much about where you grew up. Catherine's told me bits and pieces, but I'd love to hear about it from you. What was your childhood like? His fork paused halfway to his mouth. My childhood? Yes. Where you're from. Your family. I think it's important to know these things about the people who become part of our family. Catherine looked pleased. Brandon looked trapped. Well, I grew up in Ohio, he said carefully. Small town. Nothing particularly interesting about it. My parents were hardworking. They instilled good values, discipline, ambition, the importance of education. What did your parents do? I asked, my voice genuinely curious, warm. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. My father worked in manufacturing. My mother worked retail. That must have been difficult, I said sympathetically. Especially during the recession. I remember how hard that was for so many families. Did they struggle? The question was innocent on its surface. But Brandon heard what I was really asking. I could see it in the way his shoulders tensed, the way his grip on his fork tightened. Everyone struggled during the recession, he said evenly. But we got through it. And it taught me valuable lessons about resilience and determination. Of course, I said, nodding. It's remarkable what you've accomplished, coming from such humble beginnings. You should be proud of that story. So many people from difficult backgrounds never make it as far as you have. There it was. The gentlest possible acknowledgement of what he'd spent years trying to hide. That he wasn't born into the life he was now living. That he'd come from the kind of background he now looked down on. Catherine didn't notice. She thought I was being complimentary. But Brandon heard every word beneath my words. He heard me saying, I know who you really are. I don't think of my background as humble, he said, his voice taking on an edge. I think of it as normal. Regular. And there's nothing wrong with that. Nothing at all, I agreed pleasantly. Though I notice you don't mention it much. On your social media, I mean. I follow your professional updates, they're very impressive. But you never post anything about your family or where you came from. I just assumed you were a private person. You follow my social media, his expression said. Since when? I prefer to keep my professional and personal lives separate, he said. That's wise, I replied. Though I've always believed that where we come from shapes who we become. Don't you think, Catherine? My daughter, sweet and unsuspecting, nodded eagerly. Definitely. I mean, growing up the way we did, with Dad dying young and Mom working so hard to give us everything, that made me who I am. I'm proud of that. As you should be, I said, squeezing her hand. Then I looked at Brandon. And you should be proud of your story too. Working your way through school on scholarships, putting yourself through law school, building your career from nothing. That's the real American dream, isn't it? His smile was rigid. I suppose it is. I did some reading recently, I continued, my tone conversational, almost offhand. About imposter syndrome. Have you heard of it? It's that feeling high-achieving people sometimes have, where they worry they don't belong, where they fear someone will discover they're not as capable as everyone thinks. Apparently it's very common among people who've experienced significant upward mobility. People who feel like they had to hide where they came from to be accepted where they are. The table fell silent. Catherine looked confused. Brandon looked like he'd been slapped. I don't have imposter syndrome, he said quietly. Oh, I wasn't suggesting you did, I said, wide-eyed and innocent. I was just saying I read about it. It's fascinating, really. The psychology of success and the ways we protect our self-image. I find that kind of thing interesting now that I have more time to read. Though I suppose you're too busy for that sort of thing. I took a sip of wine, letting the moment stretch. If you've ever watched someone realize they've underestimated you, you'll know the particular satisfaction of that moment. The way their certainty crumbles. The way they suddenly understand that the game has changed and they didn't see it coming. Brandon was beginning to understand. The rest of dinner passed in a strange, tense cordiality. I kept the conversation light after that, asking Catherine about work, telling stories about my garden, mentioning a book club I'd joined. I was grandmother-like, harmless, exactly what Brandon had assumed I was. Except now he wasn't sure. When the check came, I paid, using a credit card I'd specifically chosen because it had a higher limit than my usual one, because I wanted Brandon to see that I wasn't as financially desperate as he'd assumed. It was a small thing, but small things add up. Small things create doubt. As we walked to our cars, Brandon was quieter than usual. Catherine chatted nervously, thanking me for dinner, suggesting we do it again soon. I hugged her tightly and told her I loved her. To Brandon, I simply said, "It was lovely getting to know you better. I feel like I understand you so much more now." His smile was brittle. Likewise. I drove home with my heart racing, my hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel. The first move had been made. I'd gotten into his head. I'd planted seeds of uncertainty, made him wonder what I knew, what I was planning, whether I was really as harmless as he'd thought. And this was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, I implemented phase 2 of my plan. I became more present in their lives, not intrusively, but noticeably. I'd text Catherine photos of flowers from my garden with sweet messages. I'd send Brandon articles about legal topics he'd mentioned, with notes like "thought you might find this interesting." I'd invite them to lunch, to coffee, always in public places where Brandon had to perform the role of dutiful son-in-law. I studied him during these interactions. I learned his patterns, his tells. I discovered that he touched his watch when he was lying, that his left eye twitched slightly when he was angry but trying to hide it, that he laughed too loud at his own jokes when he was nervous. I also learned something else. He was cruel to Catherine in small, constant ways. The way he'd correct her in conversations. The way he'd make jokes about her weight or her choice of clothes. The way he'd check his phone while she was talking, then act confused when she got upset, like she was being too sensitive. My daughter was in a prison of microaggressions and casual dismissals, and she'd normalized it so completely she didn't even recognize it as abuse. That made what I was doing feel less like revenge and more like rescue. One evening in late October, I called Brandon directly. Catherine was at a work event, and I knew he'd be home alone. "Eleanor." He sounded surprised to hear from me. "Hi, Brandon. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. I wanted to ask you something." "Sure. What is it?" I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable. Then I said, very simply, "What do you think about when you look at me?" "I'm sorry, what?" "When you look at me, what do you see?" "I'm curious. You've known me for a few years now, but I don't think we've ever really talked honestly about how you perceive me. As someone who's studied human behavior, I taught psychology for 20 years before I retired. I find people's perceptions fascinating. So I'm asking, what do you see when you look at me?" He was silent for a long moment. I could practically hear him calculating his response, trying to figure out what kind of trap this was. "I see my mother-in-law," he said finally. "Someone who cares about Catherine. Someone who's been through a lot." "That's very diplomatic," I said. "But I don't think that's what you really see. I think you see someone old. Irrelevant. Dressed like she belongs to another era. Someone who's a bit embarrassing, if we're being honest. Someone who looks like a relic." The silence on the other end was absolute. I heard you, Brandon, I said softly. At the birthday party. I heard exactly what you said about me. He didn't apologize. Didn't try to explain or excuse. He just said, very quietly, I see. Do you? I asked. Because I'm not sure you do. But you will. I promise you that. I hung up before he could respond. And then I waited for him to realize that the real lesson hadn't even begun yet. If you've stayed with me this far, I want to thank you. Stories like this aren't easy to tell, and they're not easy to hear. But they need to be told, because too many people, especially women, especially older women, carry stories of being disrespected and dismissed, and they carry them in silence. If this story is resonating with you, do me a favor. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, and check the description box below for more stories like this one. Stories about people who refused to accept being treated as less than. Because what happened next changed everything. After my phone call with Brandon, I expected retaliation. I expected him to say something to Catherine, to try to paint me as unstable or vindictive. What I didn't expect was silence. He didn't tell Catherine about the call. He didn't confront me. He simply waited. That should have been my first warning. Thanksgiving was 3 weeks away, and Catherine invited me to spend it with them. It was going to be a small gathering, just me, them, Jessica's family, and Brandon's mother, Diane, who I'd only met once before at the wedding. Brandon really wants you there, Catherine told me over the phone. He feels terrible about what happened at my birthday party. He wants to make it right. I doubted that very much. But I accepted the invitation, because I needed to see what he was planning. In chess, you can't win if you can't anticipate your opponent's moves. The 2 weeks leading up to Thanksgiving was strangely quiet. Brandon didn't call. Didn't text. When I saw him and Catherine for coffee one afternoon, he was perfectly pleasant, almost too pleasant, with a smile that looked painted on. He was planning something. I just didn't know what. Thanksgiving morning, I drove down to Connecticut with a sweet potato casserole and a sense of foreboding I couldn't shake. Jessica and her family were already there when I arrived, the kids running through the house with the kind of chaos that makes you nostalgic for when your own children were young. Brandon's mother, Diane, sat in the living room looking uncomfortable in a house that probably cost more than she'd made in a decade. She was a small woman in her mid-60s, dressed simply, her hands worn from years of retail work. When I introduced myself, she smiled with genuine warmth. Eleanor, Catherine's told me so much about you. It's lovely to finally spend some time together. We talked while the turkey cooked, and I found myself genuinely liking her. She was kind, humble, utterly unpretentious, everything her son pretended not to be. She talked about Brandon's childhood with obvious pride, about how hard he'd worked, how determined he'd been to make something of himself. He doesn't talk about those days much anymore, she said, a hint of sadness in her voice. I think he wants to forget where he came from. But I'm proud of where we came from. We didn't have much, but we had love and determination. I squeezed her hand. You raised a very successful son. I raised a son who's terrified of being ordinary, she said quietly, glancing toward the kitchen where Brandon was carving the turkey. That's not the same thing. She understood him. Maybe better than anyone. And in that moment, I felt a pang of guilt about what I was planning, because whatever I did to Brandon would hurt her too. Mothers always pay for their children's mistakes. But then dinner started, and everything went to hell. We gathered around the table, me, Catherine, Brandon, Jessica, Paul, their 2 kids, and Diane. Brandon sat at the head of the table like a king surveying his court. He poured wine, made a toast about family and gratitude, and for a moment everything seemed perfect. Then he looked at me. Eleanor, I have to say, you're looking much better lately, he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of false compliment that's actually an insult. Really? That outfit is such an improvement. It's amazing what a little effort can do. The table went quiet. Catherine's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Jessica's eyes widened. I smiled pleasantly. Thank you, Brandon. I appreciate you noticing. No, seriously, he continued, emboldened by what he perceived as my passive acceptance. I was just thinking about how you looked at Catherine's birthday party. Remember that lavender cardigan? And comparing it to now. It's like night and day. You actually look like you belong in the 21st century. Diane shifted uncomfortably. Brandon. What? He looked around the table with exaggerated innocence. I'm complimenting her. I'm saying she looks good. Better than she used to, anyway. Mom, you remember how she looked at the wedding? That floral dress situation. Brandon, stop, Catherine said quietly. But he wasn't stopping. He was drunk on his own cruelty now, performing for an audience that had stopped laughing. I'm just being honest. Eleanor, you have to admit, your style choices haven't always been contemporary, but this. He gestured at my outfit, a simple burgundy blouse and black slacks. This is presentable. This is appropriate for a woman your age. You don't look like. Like what? I asked, my voice still pleasant. He smiled. Like a relic. There it was. The word he'd thrown at me in private, now delivered publicly, deliberately, with full knowledge of what it meant. This wasn't a careless joke at a party. This was calculated cruelty, designed to humiliate me in front of my family, to put me in my place after I'd dared to challenge him. The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the kids had stopped eating. I set down my fork carefully. I looked at Brandon, really looked at him, and saw exactly what he was, a small man with a big fear, desperately trying to make himself feel larger by making others feel small. And I realized that I'd been approaching this all wrong. I'd been planning some elaborate scheme, some complex revenge that would take months to execute. But the truth was so much simpler. Brandon Mitchell was going to destroy himself. He was already doing it. All I had to do was give him the rope. Brandon, I said quietly, can I ask you something? He leaned back in his chair, confident. Of course. Why do you hate yourself so much? His smile faltered. Excuse me. I'm asking why you hate yourself. Because that's what this is, isn't it? All of this, the clothes, the car, the house, the constant need to prove you're better than everyone else. You're not trying to impress us. You're trying to convince yourself that you're not the person you're terrified of being. Eleanor, Catherine started. I held up a hand. Let me finish. Brandon, I've been where you are. Not exactly, but close enough. I spent years after Daniel died trying to prove I was enough. Good enough mother, good enough teacher, good enough woman. I wore myself out trying to be someone I thought the world would respect. And you know what I learned? The people who truly respect you don't need you to prove anything. And the people who don't respect you never will, no matter what you wear or drive or achieve. Brandon's face had gone pale. I don't know what you're. You called me a relic because you're terrified of becoming one yourself. You mock where I shop because you're ashamed of where you came from. You criticize how I look because every time you see me, you see a reminder that success and worth aren't the same thing. And that scares you, because you've built your entire identity on the lie that they are. Diane was crying quietly. Jessica was staring at me like she'd never seen me before. Catherine's hand was over her mouth. Brandon stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I don't have to listen to this psychoanalytic bullshit in my own house. No, you don't, I agreed. But your mother does. Your wife does. Your sister-in-law and her family do. And right now, they're all seeing exactly who you are. Not the image you've created. Not the performance you give. Just you. A man so insecure that he has to mock a 63-year-old woman to feel powerful. Get out, he said, his voice shaking. Brandon. Catherine stood up, torn between us. I said get out. He was shouting now, his carefully constructed composure completely shattered. This is my house, and I want her out. I stood slowly, maintaining my calm while he lost his. I'll go. But before I do, I want everyone at this table to know something. Brandon, you said I look like a relic. And maybe I do. Maybe these clothes aren't fashionable. Maybe I'm not keeping up with trends or trying to look younger than I am. But I'll tell you what I am, I'm authentic. I'm comfortable in my own skin. I've survived loss and illness and decades of struggle, and I don't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. Can you say the same? He didn't answer. He just stood there, trembling with rage and something else, something that looked like fear. I turned to Catherine. Sweetheart, I love you. And I'm sorry this happened. But I'm not sorry for what I said. You deserve better than this. I kissed Jessica's cheek, hugged Paul and the kids, and squeezed Diane's hand. Then I walked out of that house with my head high and my heart pounding. I'd driven about 20 minutes when my phone rang. It was Jessica. Mom, oh my God, Mom, you were incredible. What's happening there? I asked. Everything's falling apart. Catherine's crying. Brandon locked himself in his office. Diane is trying to comfort Catherine, and she's also crying. Paul and I are just sitting here with the kids, and honestly, I'm proud of you. I've never seen you like that. Like what? Like someone who refuses to be small just because someone else needs her to be. I had to pull over because my hands were shaking too hard to drive safely. I sat in a grocery store parking lot and let the adrenaline work its way out of my system. I'd expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I felt exhausted. And sad. Because I knew what would come next. Catherine called an hour later. She was still crying. Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have said something at my birthday party. I should have defended you. I should have. It's okay, sweetheart. It's not okay. Nothing about this is okay. He's been. God, Mom, he's been like this the whole marriage. Little comments. Little criticisms. And I got used to it. I normalized it. But watching him do that to you, hearing you stand up to him. She broke down completely. I waited until she could breathe again. What are you going to do? I don't know. He's saying you attacked him. That you came into our home and humiliated him on purpose. He's acting like he's the victim here. He probably believes that, I said. People like Brandon always do. His mom left. She was so upset. She told him he'd become exactly what he was always afraid of becoming, someone who looks down on people like her. Like his own mother. Can you believe that? I could. I absolutely could. Catherine, I need you to hear something, I said. This isn't about Thanksgiving dinner or a cardigan or anything I said tonight. This is about how he treats you. How he's been treating you. You deserve a partner who builds you up, not one who tears you down to make himself feel tall. I know, she whispered. I think I've known for a while. I just didn't want to admit I'd made a mistake. My heart broke for her. It's not a mistake to love someone. And it's not failure to walk away when love isn't enough. We talked for another hour. I didn't tell her to leave him. That had to be her decision. But I planted seeds. I asked questions. I helped her see patterns she'd been ignoring. By the time we hung up, I knew things would never be the same between Catherine and Brandon. Maybe they'd try counseling. Maybe they'd separate. Maybe she'd find the strength to leave, or maybe she'd stay and live with a man who made her feel small. I couldn't control that. All I could do was show her what it looked like to refuse to accept disrespect. When I got home that night, there was an email waiting for me. From Brandon. The subject line was just, you. The email itself was 3 paragraphs of rage. He called me manipulative. Bitter. A sad old woman who couldn't handle a joke and had decided to destroy his marriage out of spite. He said I'd humiliated him in front of his family, that I'd turned his wife against him, that I'd revealed myself to be exactly what he'd always suspected, jealous of his success and desperate to bring him down. He ended with, you look like a relic because you are a relic. You're a woman from a dead generation who doesn't understand the modern world, and instead of adapting, you've decided to drag everyone else down to your level. Stay away from my wife. Stay away from my home. You're no longer welcome in my life. I read it 3 times. Then I saved it. Then I replied with just 5 words. Thank you for proving my point. And then I went to bed, because I was exhausted. But I also slept better than I had in months. Because I'd done something I'd never done before. I'd refused to be diminished. I'd stood up for myself in the moment, without planning, without calculation, just raw honesty. And it had shattered him. His confidence vanished the moment someone refused to accept his narrative. The moment someone saw through his performance and called it what it was. The moment someone reminded him that the person he was trying so hard not to be was still there, right beneath the surface, terrified and ashamed. I'd given him a lesson he wouldn't forget. But the lesson wasn't about revenge. It was about this: when you build your entire identity on pretending to be better than other people, you give those people incredible power over you. Because all they have to do is refuse to play along, and your whole world collapses. Brandon Mitchell had spent years building a facade of superiority, and I'd torn it down in under 5 minutes, with nothing but the truth. The week after Thanksgiving, I didn't hear from Catherine. I gave her space, knowing she needed time to process what had happened. But Jessica kept me updated with daily texts that painted a picture of a marriage in free fall. Brandon had spiraled. According to Jessica, who'd been in constant contact with Catherine, he'd spent the weekend raging about me, how I'd disrespected him, how I'd manipulated everyone, how I'd ruined the holiday. He'd called his mother to complain and she'd hung up on him. He'd tried to get Catherine to agree that I'd been out of line, and when she wouldn't, he'd accused her of choosing her mother over her husband. He actually said that, Jessica texted me, "Choose me or your mother." Like she's a teenager. Catherine chose neither. She went to stay with Jessica for a few days. I spent that week in a strange state of limbo. Part of me felt guilty for what I'd set in motion. Part of me felt vindicated. But mostly, I felt something I hadn't expected, sadness. Because I'd wanted to teach Brandon a lesson, but I hadn't fully considered the collateral damage. My daughter was hurting. His mother was hurting. And yes, even Brandon was hurting, in his own distorted way. Revenge, I was learning, doesn't feel as satisfying as you think it will. It's messy and complicated and nobody walks away clean. But I also knew that what I'd done was necessary. Sometimes you have to break something that's already broken before it can be properly fixed. On Wednesday, a week after Thanksgiving, Catherine called me. "Mom, can I come see you? I need to get away from everything for a few days." "Of course, sweetheart. Come home." She arrived that evening, looking exhausted and heartbroken. We sat in my living room, the same room where she and Jessica had grown up, where we'd celebrated Christmases and birthdays, where I'd held them while they cried over failed tests and broken hearts and all the small tragedies of growing up. "Tell me everything," I said. And she did. She told me about the marriage I'd only seen from the outside. How Brandon criticized everything, her weight, her cooking, her career choices, her friends. How he'd made her feel like she was never quite good enough, never quite trying hard enough. How he'd isolated her from people who might have helped her see what was happening. "It was never physical," she said quickly, as if that made it better. "He never hit me or anything like that. It was just words. Constant little words that added up over time until I didn't recognize myself anymore." "That's still abuse," I told her gently. "You know that, right?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I do now. Watching him do that to you, seeing it from the outside, I finally understood what he'd been doing to me." "How did you know, Mom? How did you see it when I couldn't?" "Because I wasn't living it," I said. "Because I could watch how he treated you without the confusion of loving him. And because—" I paused, choosing my words carefully. "Because I've known men like Brandon. Your father wasn't one of them, thank God. But I've taught hundreds of students over the years, and I've seen that particular type before. The ones who need to feel superior to feel worthy." Catherine stayed with me for a week. We didn't talk about Brandon every day. Mostly we just existed together, the way we used to when she was young. We baked cookies. We watched old movies. We took walks through my neighborhood, looking at Christmas lights starting to appear on houses. But gradually, she started talking about her marriage with more clarity. She told me about the time he'd made fun of her in front of his colleagues. The time he'd forgotten her birthday but remembered every detail of a senior partner's golf tournament. The time he'd told her she was lucky he'd married her, because she wasn't getting any younger. "I convinced myself it was normal," she said one evening while we were washing dishes. "That all marriages had these moments. That I was being too sensitive." "He made you think that," I said. "That's what people like Brandon do. They make you doubt your own perceptions so you'll accept their version of reality." "When did you get so wise about this stuff?" she asked, trying to smile. "I'm not wise," I said. "I'm just old enough to recognize patterns. And I love you enough to refuse to watch you disappear into someone else's narrative of who you should be." On her last night before returning to Connecticut, she was going to stay with Jessica while she figured things out. Catherine asked me something I'd been waiting for. "Mom, did you plan all of this? The dinner, the things you said on Thanksgiving. Was it all calculated to make him show his true colors?" I thought about lying. About telling her it had all been spontaneous, that I'd simply reached my breaking point. But she deserved the truth. "Yes," I said. "I studied him. I learned his weaknesses. I knew if I pushed the right buttons, he'd reveal himself. But Catherine, I didn't make him say those things. I didn't put those words in his mouth. I just created the conditions where his real self came out. The cruelty was always there. I just made it visible. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Thank you." "For what?" "For loving me enough to do something that might make you look like the bad guy. For caring more about my well-being than about being liked. For showing me what it looks like to refuse to be diminished." I hugged her tight, this daughter of mine who'd somehow become a woman I was proud of all over again, in new and different ways. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "I don't know yet. But I know I can't go back to the way things were. I can't unsee what I've seen." That was enough for now. Meanwhile, while Catherine was with me, I'd been getting calls and messages from unexpected sources. Brandon's mother, Diane, called to thank me. "I've been watching him become someone I don't recognize for years," she told me. "I thought I was imagining it, that I was being too critical. But you saw it too. You said out loud what I've been too afraid to say." Some of Catherine's friends reached out, women who'd witnessed Brandon's behavior over the years but hadn't known how to address it. "We could all see it," one of them told me. "But when we'd try to say something, Kat would defend him. She'd make excuses. It's like she couldn't hear us." I thought about how invisible older women become, how easily we're dismissed. But I'd learned something through all of this. Invisibility can be a weapon. People don't guard themselves around someone they've written off as irrelevant. They get sloppy. They reveal things they'd normally hide. Brandon had looked at me and seen someone who didn't matter. That had been his first mistake. His second was assuming that someone who'd been dismissed for so long wouldn't know exactly how to use that dismissal against him. 2 weeks before Christmas, Catherine made her decision. She asked Brandon for a separation. Not a divorce, not yet, but space to figure out who she was without his voice constantly telling her who she should be. According to Jessica, Brandon didn't take it well. He tried everything: anger, tears, promises to change, accusations that I'd poisoned Catherine against him. He told her she was making the biggest mistake of her life, that she'd regret this, that she'd come crawling back. She didn't. She moved in with Jessica temporarily and started seeing a therapist who specialized in emotional abuse. She started reconnecting with friends she'd lost touch with during her marriage. She started, slowly and painfully, to remember who she'd been before Brandon Mitchell had convinced her she wasn't enough. And Brandon? He threw himself into his work, according to the firm's website, where he'd started posting even more aggressively about his cases and victories. But I noticed something in those posts, a desperation that hadn't been there before. A need to prove something to an audience that wasn't paying as much attention as he thought. I also noticed, through my continued careful observation of his social media, that he'd started posting photos from his childhood. Images of his parents' modest house. A picture of his father in his factory uniform. A long caption about never forgetting where you come from and staying grounded. He was trying to reclaim the narrative I'd exposed. Trying to turn his shame into a badge of honor before anyone else could use it against him. But it was too late. The people in his life had seen behind the curtain. They'd seen the fear and insecurity that drove him. And you can't unsee that. You can't pretend you don't know someone's fundamental truth once it's been revealed. On Christmas Eve, Catherine called me. "Mom, I need to tell you something." My heart jumped. "What is it?" "I'm filing for divorce. After Christmas, I'm going to start the paperwork." I closed my eyes, feeling a mix of relief and sorrow. "How do you feel about that?" "Scared," she admitted. "Sad. Angry at myself for not seeing it sooner. But also, free. For the first time in 3 years, I feel like I can breathe." "I'm proud of you," I told her. "I'm proud of you too, Mom. What you did, standing up to him like that, it wasn't just about you. It was about showing me what strength looks like. Real strength. Not the performance of it, but the actual thing." After we hung up, I sat in my living room looking at my Christmas tree, a small, modest thing I'd decorated by myself with ornaments I'd collected over decades. Each one told a story. The handmade ones from when the girls were young, the ones Daniel had bought me, the ones I'd picked up on travels and during hard years and good years. I thought about Brandon calling me a relic, and I realized he'd been right in a way he didn't intend. I was a relic. I was a keeper of stories and memories, a holder of history, a connection to the past that gave context to the present. And there was power in that. There was strength in knowing who you were and where you'd been, in not needing to hide your history or pretend to be something you weren't. Brandon had meant it as an insult. But I turned it into something else entirely. A reminder that some things, dignity, authenticity, hard-won wisdom, don't go out of style. They just get mistaken for weaknesses by people who've forgotten what real strength looks like. His confidence had vanished the moment someone refused to be intimidated by his performance. And that was the real lesson. Confidence built on contempt for others is just fear wearing a mask. Real confidence doesn't need anyone else to be small. I'd given him a lesson he'd never forget. But more importantly, I'd given one to my daughter, and to myself, that it's never too late to refuse to be diminished. That age doesn't make you irrelevant unless you accept that narrative. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply tell the truth and let the chips fall where they may. January came with grey skies and the particular cold that seeps into your bones. Catherine filed for divorce the second week of the new year. I expected Brandon to fight it. His ego wouldn't easily accept being the one left behind, but what happened instead surprised everyone. He agreed to the divorce immediately. No contest, no drawn-out battle, just a swift agreement to end the marriage. Jessica called me with the news. "It's weird, Mom." Kat's relieved, obviously, but she's also confused. She expected him to make it difficult, to punish her for leaving. But he's acting like he couldn't sign the papers fast enough. "Maybe he's trying to save face," I suggested. "Make it look like it was mutual, like his being reasonable." But that wasn't it. I found out the real reason 2 weeks later, and it changed everything I thought I understood about what I'd done. Catherine came to visit me on a Saturday afternoon. She looked better than she had in months, clearer, lighter somehow, but there was something troubled in her expression. "Mom, I need to show you something," she said, pulling out her phone. "Brandon's therapist contacted me." Well, not his therapist exactly, but someone from the psychiatric facility where he's been staying. I felt my stomach drop. What? After I left, after I filed for divorce, he had some kind of breakdown. Complete mental collapse. He checked himself into an inpatient facility in Massachusetts. He's been there for 3 weeks. She showed me an email from a Dr. Patricia Rodriguez, explaining that Brandon had authorized her to contact Catherine as part of his treatment. The email was professional, careful, but the message was clear. Brandon Mitchell was in serious psychological crisis. "They say he had a dissociative episode," Catherine explained. "He showed up at his mother's house in Ohio in the middle of the night, completely disheveled, talking about how his life was fake and he didn't know who he was anymore. Diane got scared and took him to the ER. They transferred him to this facility." I sat down heavily. "Catherine, I never meant for." "I know, Mom. I know. And the therapist says it wasn't any one thing. She says he's been building toward this for years. The marriage ending was just the final stressor in a long pattern of psychological stress." But I knew better. I knew that what I'd done at Thanksgiving, stripping away his carefully constructed identity in front of the people whose opinions mattered most, had been the earthquake that had finally brought down a structure that was already crumbling. I'd wanted to teach him a lesson. I'd wanted him to understand what it felt like to be diminished. But I'd never considered that behind all that cruelty and arrogance was someone who was genuinely fragile. Someone whose entire sense of self was so precariously balanced that the truth could shatter it completely. "Does his mother know?" I asked quietly. "She does. She's been visiting him. And Mom." Catherine hesitated. "She wants to talk to you." 3 days later, I drove to Ohio. It took me 8 hours, time I spent wrestling with guilt, regret, and a complicated anger that wouldn't quite dissipate no matter how much I told myself I should feel sorry for Brandon. Diane lived in a small house on a street where every lawn had the same defeated look, where the cars were old and the paint was peeling. The America that politicians promised had been left behind decades ago, I thought as I parked. This was where Brandon had come from. This was what he'd spent his adult life running from. Diane welcomed me with surprising warmth. She made tea, settled me on a couch that had definitely seen better days, and then said something I didn't expect. "Thank you for coming. And thank you for what you did at Thanksgiving." I blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "I know everyone probably thinks you broke my son. And maybe you did, in a way. But Eleanor, he was already broken. He's been broken since he was a teenager and his father got laid off and we lost everything. He watched his dad, this strong, proud man, turn into someone defeated and bitter. And Brandon decided right then that he would never be that person. That he would never be poor or ordinary or looked down on. She took a sip of her tea, her eyes distant. But here's what he didn't understand. You can't build a life on running away from something. You have to run toward something. And all Brandon did was run. He ran so hard and so fast that he forgot who he actually was. He created this other person, this successful, confident attorney, and then he got trapped inside that character. He couldn't let anyone see the scared kid underneath. "I'm so sorry," I said. "I never meant to hurt him this badly." "Didn't you?" she asked, not unkindly. "I mean, be honest with me. When you planned that dinner, when you confronted him at Thanksgiving, weren't you trying to hurt him? To punish him for hurting you?" I met her eyes. Yes. I was. But I thought he was strong enough to take it. I thought I was just deflating his ego, not destroying his entire sense of self. Diane nodded slowly. That's the thing about people like Brandon. They look strong because they're so good at performing strength. But performances are exhausting. They require constant maintenance. And when someone sees through the performance, really sees through it, the whole thing can collapse. "What's going to happen to him?" I asked. "I don't know. The doctors say he's making progress. He's on medication for depression and anxiety. Apparently he's been suffering from both for years without treatment. He's doing intensive therapy. They're trying to help him figure out who he actually is underneath all the pretense." "Can I see him?" The words came out before I'd thought them through. Diane looked surprised. "Why would you want to?" "Because I need to understand. I need to know if what I did was justice or just cruelty dressed up as principle." She studied me for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone. 2 days later, with Diane beside me, I walked into the psychiatric facility in Massachusetts. It was nicer than I'd expected. More like a retreat center than a hospital, with warm lighting and comfortable furniture and none of the institutional coldness I'd anticipated. Brandon was in a common room, staring out a window. He looked different, smaller somehow, like someone had let the air out of him. He wore sweatpants and a plain t-shirt. His hair was uncombed. His hands were shaking slightly. When he saw me, something complicated passed across his face. Not anger, exactly. Something more like shame mixed with resignation. "Eleanor," he said quietly. "Brandon." We sat at a table in the corner while Diane gave us space. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "For what I said to you. For how I treated you. For all of it." "Are you saying that because you mean it, or because your therapist told you to?" A ghost of his old smile flickered across his face. "Both, probably. But I do mean it. I've been sitting here for 3 weeks, doing nothing but thinking about my life, and I've realized how many people I've hurt. How much damage I've done trying to protect an image that was never real in the first place." "Why did you do it?" I asked. "Why build your whole life on a lie?" "Because the truth was too painful," he said simply. "I was the poor kid. The one with the factory worker dad and the retail worker mom. The one who wore Goodwill clothes and used free lunch tickets. And I was smart enough to see that the world treated people like my parents like they were disposable. Like they didn't matter. And I decided I would never be them. I would never be dismissed or overlooked or treated like I was less than." "So you became someone who dismissed and overlooked others," I said. He flinched. "Yes. I became exactly what I hated. I just didn't see it until you showed me. When you called me a relic." "I was terrified of you," he interrupted. "You reminded me of everyone I'd left behind. Everyone I'd decided wasn't good enough. And I thought if I could make you seem ridiculous, if I could make other people laugh at you, then I wouldn't have to face the fact that you had something I'd lost." "What's that?" "Authenticity. Peace with who you are. You weren't pretending. You weren't performing. You were just yourself. And I hated that because I couldn't remember the last time I'd been just myself." I let that sit between us. Then I said, "You hurt my daughter. For 3 years, you made her feel like she wasn't enough. You isolated her and criticized her and made her doubt herself. That's not about protecting an image, Brandon. That's about control. That's about needing someone else to be small so you could feel big." He nodded, tears streaming down his face now. "I know. And I hate myself for it. But Eleanor, I need you to understand something. When you stood up at Thanksgiving and said all those things, about my childhood, about my insecurity, about who I really was, It was like you'd ripped off a mask I'd been wearing for so long I'd forgotten it was a mask. And underneath it was nothing. Just emptiness and fear and shame. I looked at myself through your eyes, and I saw someone pathetic. Someone who'd wasted his whole adult life running from a shadow. What do you see now? I asked. Someone who needs to start over. Someone who needs to figure out who he actually is, not who he thinks he should be. My therapist keeps asking me what I want, and I don't know how to answer because I've spent so long wanting what I thought I was supposed to want. We talked for another hour. He told me about his therapy, about the medications, about the slow, painful process of dismantling a personality he'd spent decades building. He told me he'd resigned from his law firm, that he couldn't go back to that life even if he wanted to. Where will you go? I asked. I don't know. Maybe nowhere for a while. Maybe I just need to stop running long enough to figure out where I actually want to be. Before I left, I asked him one more question. Did I do the right thing? Standing up to you the way I did. He thought about it for a long time. Then he said, you did what you needed to do. And maybe I needed it too, even though it broke me. Maybe I needed to break before I could start to heal. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. And it wasn't redemption. But it was something, a recognition that the line between justice and cruelty, between teaching a lesson and destroying someone, is thinner than we'd like to believe. I left Massachusetts feeling more complicated about everything than when I'd arrived. And I thought about all the stories I'd heard about revenge, about people getting what they deserved, about karma and justice and standing up for yourself. Nobody tells you about the aftermath. About how messy it is. About how getting what you wanted doesn't always feel the way you expected. About how sometimes the person you defeat turns out to be more broken than cruel, and then you have to live with what you've done. But I also thought about Catherine, who was rebuilding her life and her sense of self. About the lesson I'd taught not just Brandon but my daughters and maybe even myself, that refusing to be diminished matters. That truth matters. That sometimes you have to break something before it can be fixed. And I thought about what Brandon had said, that I had authenticity, peace with who I was. Because he was right. Whatever else had happened, I'd refused to pretend to be someone I wasn't to make him comfortable. And there was power in that, even when the consequences were more complicated than I'd anticipated. Spring came slowly that year. I watched it from my living room window, the gradual greening of the lawn, the tulips pushing through soil that had been frozen for months, the birds returning with their chaotic morning songs. Everything was waking up, starting over, trying again. I thought about that a lot, starting over. What it meant. Whether it was possible. Whether any of us ever really changed or if we just became different versions of the same people, carrying our damage in slightly different ways. Catherine's divorce was finalized in March. She came to spend the weekend with me, and we celebrated with cheap wine and expensive cheese and old movies that made us cry for reasons that had nothing to do with the plots. I'm seeing someone, she told me on Sunday morning while we drank coffee on my porch. Already. I tried to keep the surprise out of my voice. She laughed. Not romantically. A therapist. I've been going twice a week since January. And I'm learning things I wish I'd learned years ago. About boundaries. About self-worth. About how I confused being accommodating with being loving. She looked at me. I'm also learning about family patterns. About how we internalize things from our parents without realizing it. What do you mean? I asked, though I had a feeling I knew where this was going. You were always so strong, Mom. After Dad died, you never fell apart, at least not where we could see it. You worked 2 jobs, you kept the house, you made sure we had everything we needed. You never complained. You never asked for help. You just endured. I did what I had to do. I know. But I think I learned from watching you that women are supposed to sacrifice themselves. That we're supposed to put everyone else first and never make demands. And that's what I did with Brandon. I accommodated and adjusted and made myself smaller, thinking that's what wives are supposed to do. I felt something twist in my chest. Catherine, I never meant to teach you that. I know you didn't. But kids learn from what they see, not what we tell them. And I saw you disappear a little more each year, giving up things you wanted, wearing clothes from thrift stores even when you could afford new ones, never dating, never putting yourself first. She wasn't wrong. After Daniel died, I'd poured everything into my daughters. I'd convinced myself that's what good mothers did, that self-sacrifice was love. But maybe I'd been running too, in my own way. Not from poverty or shame like Brandon, but from grief and loneliness and the terrifying question of who I was without a husband, without children who needed me. My therapist says what you did at Thanksgiving was important, Catherine continued. Not just because you stood up to Brandon, but because you showed me what it looks like to refuse to disappear. To claim space. To say I matter even when someone's trying to tell you that you don't. I'm not sure I did the right thing, I admitted. I saw Brandon. In Massachusetts. Did I tell you that? She shook her head, eyes widening. I told her about the visit, about seeing Brandon broken and medicated and trying to piece himself back together. About the conversation we'd had, about his apology and his breakdown and the complicated truth that he wasn't just a villain but a damaged person who'd damaged others. Do you regret it? She asked when I finished. What you did? I thought about that carefully. I regret that he got hurt that badly. I regret that it took something so destructive to free you from that marriage. But do I regret standing up to him? No. Someone needed to. And maybe it had to be me because I was the one person in his life who had nothing to lose. His mom called me last week, Catherine said. Diane. She wanted to make sure I was okay. She apologized for Brandon, for raising someone who could treat me the way he did. I told her it wasn't her fault, but I don't think she believed me. Mothers always blame themselves, I said quietly. We sat in silence for a while, watching my neighbor's dog chase squirrels across their yard. I'm not going back to him, Catherine said suddenly. Even now, knowing what he's going through, I'm not going back. Does that make me cruel? It makes you healthy, I told her. Compassion doesn't mean accepting abuse. You can wish him well and still protect yourself. I do wish him well, she said. I hope he gets better. I hope he figures out who he is. But I also hope I never have to see him again. That seemed fair to me. Jessica visited the following week with her family. While the kids played in my backyard and Paul helped me fix a leaky faucet, Jessica and I sat at my kitchen table and talked about everything that had happened. You know people are talking about it, right? Jessica said. The Thanksgiving thing. It's become this story in our family, in Catherine's friend group. The time Eleanor took down Brandon Mitchell. That's not what I did, I protested. Isn't it, though? I mean, I watched it happen. You completely dismantled him in under 5 minutes. It was terrifying and impressive and honestly, Mom, I didn't know you had that in you. Neither did I admitted. Paul says what you did was justified but dangerous. He says you poked a bear that could have turned violent. He's not wrong. Men like Brandon can be unpredictable when their egos get bruised. I'd thought about that too, in the months since Thanksgiving. How different everything could have gone if Brandon had reacted with violence instead of breakdown. How lucky I'd been, in a way, that his fragility manifested as self-destruction rather than outward aggression. I was angry, I told Jessica. I was so angry I wasn't thinking about consequences. I just wanted him to feel what I'd felt. To understand what it's like to be diminished. Do you think he does? Understand, I mean. I think he's starting to. But understanding and healing are different things. He might understand what he did and still never be able to change. Jessica reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You protected Catherine. That's what matters. She was drowning and she didn't even know it, and you threw her a lifeline. Even if it meant becoming the villain in Brandon's story. But I didn't feel like a hero or a villain. I felt like someone who'd acted out of rage and love and complicated human messiness, and who was still trying to figure out if the end justified the means. That night, after Jessica and her family left, I got an email. From Brandon. My first instinct was to delete it without reading. But curiosity won out. Eleanor. It began. My therapist suggested I write this letter as part of my treatment, but I would have written it anyway. I owe you more than an apology, though that's all I have to give right now. I've spent the past 3 months in therapy learning about something called narcissistic personality disorder. The doctors say I have traits of it, though not the full disorder. I'm apparently self-aware enough that full NPD doesn't quite fit. But the traits are there, the need for admiration, the lack of empathy, the belief that I'm special and unique and above others. They tell me it probably developed as a defense mechanism. That the shame I felt about my childhood, about my father's failure, about our poverty, about being less than, was so intolerable that I created this other self. This person who wasn't ashamed. Who couldn't be hurt because he was better than everyone else. But here's what I'm learning. That defense mechanism didn't protect me. It isolated me. It turned me into someone who hurt people I should have loved. It made me cruel to you, and to Catherine, and to my own mother. It made me into exactly the kind of person I despised when I was young. Someone who looked down on others to feel superior. What you did at Thanksgiving, calling me out in front of my family, exposing the truth I'd spent years hiding, it felt like you'd murdered me. Like you'd taken the person I'd worked so hard to become and revealed him as a fake. And in a way, you did. That person was a fake. But he was all I had. I'm not writing this to make you feel guilty. You did what you needed to do. And if I'm being honest with myself, someone needed to do it. I'd become dangerous, not physically, but psychologically. I was damaging everyone close to me, and I couldn't see it because I'd convinced myself I was the victim. The one being misunderstood and unappreciated. I'm trying to build something new now. Something real. My therapist keeps asking me who I want to be, and I still don't have a good answer. But I'm learning who I don't want to be. I don't want to be someone who needs others to be small so I can feel big. I don't want to be someone who mistakes cruelty for strength. I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't expect anything from you. But I wanted you to know that what you did mattered. It broke me, but maybe I needed to be broken. Maybe that was the only way I could start to heal. I hope Catherine is happy. I hope she finds someone who deserves her, because I never did. And I hope you know that you taught me something I couldn't learn any other way. That the truth, no matter how painful, is better than a beautiful lie. Brandon. I read the email 3 times. Then I closed my laptop and sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about accountability and redemption and whether people like Brandon, people like any of us, ever really changed. I didn't respond to the email. Not because I was angry, but because I didn't know what to say. You're welcome seemed inappropriate. I forgive you felt premature. Some conversations don't need responses. Some acknowledgements are enough on their own. But I did save the email. Because it felt important somehow, evidence that even our worst actions can create unexpected consequences. That breaking someone can sometimes be the first step toward them healing. That the line between destruction and transformation is sometimes the same line, viewed from different angles. May brought my 64th birthday. My daughters took me out to dinner. The 3 of us, no husbands or boyfriends or complicated dynamics. Just us, the way it used to be. Make a wish, Mom, Catherine said when they brought out a cake with candles. I looked at my daughters, both beautiful, both strong, both still figuring out their lives just like I was still figuring out mine. And I thought about what I'd wish for if wishes were real. Not to undo what I'd done. Not to change the past. But maybe for all of us to learn how to carry our damage with more grace. To forgive ourselves for not being perfect. To understand that sometimes the messy, complicated choices are the only honest ones. I blew out the candles without telling them what I wished for. Some things are better kept private. What did you wish for? Jessica asked anyway. Peace, I said. For all of us. It was true, even if it wasn't the whole truth. Because the whole truth was this. I wished for the wisdom to know when standing up for yourself is justice and when it's just revenge. When teaching someone a lesson is necessary and when it's cruelty wearing a righteous mask. When the truth will set someone free and when it will just break them. I didn't have that wisdom yet. Maybe I never would. But I was learning to live with the ambiguity, with the gray spaces between right and wrong where most of life actually happens. And maybe that was its own kind of lesson, one I was still teaching myself, one day at a time. Summer arrived with the kind of heat that makes you slow down, that turns ambition into lethargy. I spent most of June in my garden, which had become more important to me in recent months. There was something honest about gardening. You planted things, you tended them, and they either grew or they didn't. No performances, no pretense, just dirt and water and patience. Catherine started dating someone in July. A man named Thomas who worked as a high school teacher, who wore comfortable clothes and laughed easily and never once criticized her cooking or her weight or her choice of words. She brought him to meet me, and I watched carefully for signs of the patterns I'd seen with Brandon. But Thomas was different. Softer. More genuine. Or maybe Catherine was different. More aware, more boundaried, less willing to shrink herself to make space for someone else's ego. What do you think? She asked me after Thomas left. after we'd spent an afternoon drinking iced tea on my porch while he told self-deprecating stories about his students. "I think he's kind," I said. "And I think you deserve kind. He's nothing like Brandon." "Is that why you like him?" She considered that. "Maybe partly. But also, he makes me feel like myself. Like I don't have to perform or prove anything. I can just exist, and that's enough." I squeezed her hand. That's what it should feel like. But not everyone was moving forward as smoothly. Jessica called me one evening in late July, her voice tight with stress. "Mom, I need to vent. Is that okay?" "Always." Paul's brother made a comment about Catherine's divorce at a family barbecue yesterday. Something about how she gave up too easily and didn't try hard enough to make it work. And Paul he didn't say anything. He didn't defend her. He just sort of nodded along like maybe his brother had a point. I felt my jaw tighten. "What did you say?" "I lost it, Mom." I told his brother that he had no idea what he was talking about, that Catherine was emotionally abused for 3 years, and that anyone who thinks she should have tried harder is part of the problem. And then Paul got mad at me for making a scene. "How do you feel about Paul's reaction?" I asked carefully. "Honestly, disappointed. And scared. Because it makes me wonder what he really thinks. If he secretly agrees with his brother. If he thinks women should just endure bad marriages because commitment is more important than happiness or safety." "Have you talked to him about it?" "We tried. It turned into a fight. He says I'm being too sensitive, that his brother was just making conversation, that I'm projecting my anger about Brandon onto him. And maybe I am. But also, Mom, this matters. The way he responded, or didn't respond, matters." I listened as she worked through her thoughts, as she questioned whether this was a one-time thing or a pattern she'd been ignoring, whether she was overreacting or finally seeing something clearly. "What would you do?" she asked finally. "I'd trust my instincts," I told her. "If it feels important, it probably is. And I'd pay attention to how he responds when you express hurt or disappointment. Does he listen? Does he get defensive? Does he try to understand, or does he minimize your feelings?" "He gets defensive," she said quietly. "Every time." We talked for another hour. I didn't tell her to leave Paul or even to confront him more forcefully, but I asked her questions. I helped her see patterns. I reminded her that she deserved to be heard in her own marriage. After we hung up, I thought about family systems, about how dysfunction echoes across generations, about how the lessons we learn in one relationship shape how we show up in others. I taught my daughters to be strong by example, but I'd also taught them to sacrifice themselves. To endure. To make themselves smaller to keep the peace. And now both of my daughters were having to unlearn those lessons, to fight against instincts I'd inadvertently instilled in them. Parenting, I was discovering, doesn't end when your children become adults. The consequences of your choices, both good and bad, continue to ripple outward, shaping lives in ways you never intended. In August, I did something I'd been considering for months. I enrolled in a watercolor painting class at the community center. It was full of other older adults, mostly women, all of us trying to learn something new in the second half of our lives. The instructor was a woman in her 70s named Ruth who'd been a professional artist before retirement. She had gray hair she wore in a long braid, paint-stained clothes, and a directness I appreciated. "Most of you will never be great at this," she told us on the first day. But that's not the point. The point is to create something. To express something. To spend time making instead of consuming. I was terrible at painting. My flowers looked like sad blobs. My landscapes were muddy and indistinct. But Ruth was right, it didn't matter. What mattered was the act of trying. Of sitting with uncertainty and imperfection. Of creating something that didn't have to serve any purpose beyond its own existence. One evening after class, Ruth invited me for coffee. We sat in a diner that had probably been there since the 60s, and she asked me about my life. I found myself telling her about Catherine's marriage and divorce, about Brandon's breakdown, about my own complicated feelings about what I'd done. "So you're wondering if you're a hero or a villain," Ruth said when I finished. "I suppose I am." "What if you're neither? What if you're just a person who acted out of pain and love and complicated human messiness? Why does it have to be heroic or villainous? Why can't it just be human?" I'd never thought of it that way. I wanted to believe I was teaching him a lesson. That it was about justice. Maybe it was. But maybe it was also about revenge. And maybe those things aren't mutually exclusive. Maybe you can be justified in your anger and still cause damage. Maybe the world isn't as clean as we want it to be. That's not very comforting, I said. No, Ruth agreed. But it's true. And I think truth is more important than comfort, don't you? I did. That's what this whole thing had been about, really, choosing truth over comfort. Over politeness. Over the social contract that says we're supposed to swallow our hurt and smile through our humiliation. I spent 40 years being polite, I told Ruth. Accommodating. Not making waves. And where did it get me? I became invisible. Irrelevant. Someone people thought they could dismiss or mock without consequence. And now? Now I'm visible. But visibility comes with consequences too. My daughter's marriage ended. Her husband had a mental breakdown. And I lie awake at night wondering if I'm responsible for that destruction. Ruth reached across the table and patted my hand. Eleanor, you didn't destroy Brandon Mitchell. He destroyed himself years ago when he decided to build his identity on a lie. You just happened to be the person who noticed the foundation was crumbling. If it hadn't been you, it would have been someone else eventually. Or worse, it would have been no one, and he would have continued hurting people indefinitely. You really believe that? I do. And I think you need to believe it too. Not because it absolves you of responsibility, but because carrying guilt that isn't fully yours will destroy you. Trust me, I spent 20 years feeling guilty for leaving an abusive marriage. 20 years thinking I should have tried harder, done more, been better. And all that guilt did was keep me small and ashamed. It didn't help anyone. I drove home that night thinking about Ruth's words. About the difference between accountability and self-flagellation. About how women are so often taught to carry guilt that isn't ours, to blame ourselves for other people's choices, to believe we're responsible for everyone's happiness but our own. September brought cooler weather and the start of a new school year. Even though I'd been retired for years, I still felt the rhythm of September. The sense of new beginnings, fresh starts, blank pages waiting to be filled. I got another email from Brandon. He was out of the inpatient facility now, living with his mother in Ohio, working at a legal aid clinic helping low-income clients with housing disputes and immigration issues. It was a far cry from corporate law, from the expensive office and the prestigious clients and the performance of success. I'm learning to be useful instead of impressive, he wrote. It's harder than you'd think. Every day I have to fight the instinct to prove myself, to make sure everyone knows I'm smart and capable and important. But I'm trying to just do the work without needing recognition for it. To help people who need help, not because it makes me look good, but because it's the right thing to do. He didn't ask how I was. Didn't ask about Catherine. Just shared where he was, what he was learning. It felt like therapy homework, the assignment to practice accountability without expecting forgiveness or redemption. I still didn't respond. But I was glad he was alive. Glad he was trying. Glad that destruction hadn't been the end of his story, just a painful middle chapter. Catherine and Thomas got engaged in October. It was quick, only 3 months of dating, but Catherine was different now. She knew what red flags looked like. She knew what her boundaries were. She knew that fast didn't necessarily mean reckless if you were paying attention to the right things. I'm not making the same mistakes, she told me when she showed me the ring. A simple band with a small stone, nothing flashy or expensive. Thomas isn't perfect. But he's honest. He's kind. And he makes me feel safe. That's worth more than anything Brandon ever gave me. The wedding was planned for spring. Small, intimate, just family and close friends. Catherine asked if I was okay with Brandon's mother being invited. She's been so supportive, Catherine explained. And she's not responsible for who Brandon became. I'd like her there if you're comfortable with it. Of course, I said. Diane's a good woman. She deserves to celebrate something joyful after everything she's been through. But privately, I wondered if Diane blamed me. If she looked at me and saw the person who'd broken her son. We hadn't spoken since that day in Massachusetts, hadn't addressed the elephant that would always be in the room between us. I called her one evening. We talked for 2 hours, about our sons and daughters, about the mistakes we'd made as mothers, about the guilt we carried and whether we had the right to carry it. About whether love was enough when the person you loved was fundamentally broken. I don't blame you, Diane told me before we hung up. I blamed myself for a long time. For not seeing what he was becoming. For not intervening earlier. But my therapist, yes, I'm seeing someone too now, she helped me understand that Brandon's choices were his own. That I gave him the tools to build a healthy life, and he chose to build something else. That's not my fault. And what you did at Thanksgiving, that's not your fault either. You responded to cruelty with truth. That's not the same as attacking someone. Thank you, I said, and meant it. For what? For not hating me. Eleanor, I could never hate you. You loved your daughter enough to fight for her. That's all any mother wants, to protect their child. You did that. I couldn't. After that conversation, something in me relaxed. Some knot I'd been carrying since Thanksgiving finally loosened. I wasn't a villain in everyone's story. I wasn't universally hated or blamed. I was just a person who'd made a choice in an impossible situation, and people would interpret that choice through their own lenses, their own experiences, their own needs. I couldn't control how the story was told. I could only control whether I regretted telling my truth. And I didn't. Not anymore. Catherine's wedding was on a Saturday in late April, when the world was green and new and full of possibility. The ceremony was outdoors at a small vineyard in the Hudson Valley, with mountains visible in the distance and the smell of earth and growing things everywhere. I wore a dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, not expensive, but beautiful. Elegant. The kind of thing that made me feel like myself, but elevated. Jessica had helped me pick it out, and when I put it on the morning of the wedding, I barely recognized the woman in the mirror. Not because I looked different, but because I looked happy, peaceful. Like someone who'd fought a battle and survived it, scars and all. The wedding was small, maybe 40 people. Thomas's family, warm and uncomplicated, filled half the chairs. Our side was smaller, me, Jessica and her family, a handful of Catherine's friends, and Diane, who'd driven up from Ohio and who hugged me tightly when we saw each other, both of us crying before the ceremony even started. She looks so happy, Diane whispered, watching Catherine get ready in a small room off the main hall. She is, I said. Finally. Brandon wasn't there, obviously. But his absence was present anyway, the way absences always are. Catherine had told me she'd called him before the wedding, had told him she was getting married, had wished him well. He'd apparently congratulated her, told her he was glad she'd found happiness, and asked her not to contact him again. He said he needs to stay away from his old life if he's going to build a new one, Catherine had explained. And I get that. I hope he makes it. But I also hope I never see him again. That seemed like the healthiest possible outcome: mutual distance, mutual respect, mutual release. The ceremony was simple and genuine. Thomas cried when he saw Catherine walking toward him. She cried too. They wrote their own vows, and Thomas's included a line that made my chest ache: I promise to love you in a way that makes you feel bigger, not smaller. To celebrate who you are instead of trying to change you. To be a partner, not a project manager. I looked over at Jessica, who was crying openly. Paul sat beside her, looking uncomfortable in his suit. They'd been in counseling since the summer, working through the fight about his brother's comment and other accumulated resentments. I didn't know if they'd make it. Some marriages do, some don't, and sometimes the best you can hope for is that people try. At the reception, I found myself talking with Thomas's mother, Linda, a woman about my age with laugh lines and comfortable shoes and no pretense about her. I'm so grateful Catherine found my son, she told me. He dated some real pieces of work before her. Women who wanted him to be someone he wasn't. But with Catherine, he's just himself. Happy. Easy. That's all any of us want, I said. To be loved for who we actually are, not who someone thinks we should be. Eleanor, can I ask you something? And please tell me if it's too personal. I nodded. Catherine mentioned that her first husband was difficult. That the marriage was hard. She didn't give me details, but I got the sense it was more than just incompatibility. Was he cruel to her? I thought about how to answer that. He was cruel to himself, I said finally. And that cruelty spilled over onto everyone around him. He couldn't accept who he really was, so he created this false self. And maintaining that false self required him to make everyone else feel small. Do you think people like that can change? She asked. I think they can, I said. But only if they're willing to completely dismantle who they've been and start over. And most people aren't willing to do that. The demolition is too painful. We watched Catherine and Thomas dance, watched them laugh together, watched the ease between them. And I thought about all the miles that had been traveled to get to this moment, the pain and breakdown and hard conversations and therapy sessions and midnight phone calls. The destruction that had been necessary before reconstruction could begin. Later in the evening, Diane found me sitting alone, taking a break from the noise and celebration. "Can I join you?" she asked. Of course. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the party from a distance. "I got a letter from Brandon last week," she said eventually. "He's doing better. Not perfect, but better. He's dating someone, a woman who works at the legal aid clinic with him. Someone who knew him only as this quiet, hard-working guy, not as the person he used to pretend to be." "I'm glad," I said, and meant it. "He asked me to tell you something if I saw you. He said to tell you he understands now what you were trying to do. That you weren't trying to destroy him. You were trying to make him visible. To show him what he looked like from the outside. And that even though it nearly killed him, it saved his life." I felt tears prick my eyes. "That's very generous of him." "His learning generosity," Diane said. "Along with humility and honesty and all the other things he should have learned 20 years ago. Better late than never, I suppose." "Diane, I'm sorry." "Don't," she interrupted gently. "Don't apologize. You did what needed to be done. And yes, it was painful. For all of us. But sometimes pain is how we learn. Sometimes we have to hit bottom before we can start climbing back up." "Do you think he'll make it?" I asked. "Do you think he'll become someone better?" "I think he's trying. And that's all any of us can do. Try. Fail. Try again. Learn from our failures and keep going." She squeezed my hand, and we sat together watching my daughter dance with her new husband, both of us thinking about our children, about the people they'd become and the journeys they'd taken to get there. Jessica found me later, slightly drunk and very emotional. "Mom, I need to tell you something," she said, pulling me aside. "What is it?" "I'm leaving Paul. I've decided. After seeing Kat today, seeing how happy she is with someone who actually respects her, I can't go back to a marriage where I'm constantly accommodating and adjusting and making myself smaller." "Oh, sweetheart." I hugged her tightly. "I'm sorry. But I'm also proud of you." "Are you?" "Because I feel like I'm failing. Like I'm giving up." "You're not giving up," I told her firmly. "You're choosing yourself. There's a difference. And I wish I'd learned that lesson earlier. I wish I'd taught you that women are allowed to choose themselves." "You taught us eventually," she said. "That's what matters." As the evening wound down and guests started to leave, Catherine found me. "Thank you, Mom," she said. "For everything. For standing up to Brandon when I couldn't. For showing me what strength looks like. For teaching me, even if it took a while, that I deserve to be loved well." "You're welcome, baby. I'd do it all again." "I know you would. That's what makes you dangerous." She grinned. "You're like some kind of avenging angel for disrespected older women." I laughed. "That's probably not how I should be remembered." "Why not? It's better than being invisible." She was right about that. That night, driving home alone in the dark, I thought about everything that had happened since that September afternoon when Brandon had called me a relic. How one moment of cruelty had set off a chain reaction that changed multiple lives in ways none of us could have predicted. If I could go back, knowing everything I know now, would I do it differently? Would I smile through the insult and let it go? Would I protect Brandon from his own fragility? Would I choose peace over truth? No, I wouldn't. Because here's what I'd learned: being kind to cruel people doesn't make them less cruel. It just makes them more comfortable with their cruelty. And staying silent in the face of disrespect doesn't preserve relationships, it just teaches people that you're willing to tolerate being diminished. I'd taught Brandon a lesson he'd never forget. But I'd also taught myself one: that I mattered. That my dignity mattered. That refusing to be small was worth whatever consequences came with it. And maybe that was the real lesson all along, not for him, but for me. That after decades of accommodating and adjusting and making myself smaller to make room for others, I still had the capacity to claim space. To stand tall. To say, "I see you seeing me, and I refuse to accept your version of who I am." His confidence had vanished when confronted with someone who wouldn't accept his performance. And in the process, I'd found a confidence I didn't know I had, not the performative kind he'd relied on, but the quiet, steady kind that comes from knowing who you are and refusing to pretend otherwise. It's been almost 2 years since that Thanksgiving dinner. 2 years since I looked across a table and told Brandon Mitchell the truth he'd been running from his entire adult life. 2 years since everything fell apart and everyone had to decide who they'd become in the aftermath. Here's where everyone landed. Catherine and Thomas are happy. Genuinely, boringly, beautifully happy in the way that healthy relationships are. No drama, no crises, just two people building a life together based on mutual respect and genuine affection. They're talking about having kids. Catherine's thriving in her career, more confident than I've ever seen her. She tells me she doesn't miss her old life at all, doesn't miss the woman she was when she was married to Brandon. Jessica left Paul last year. It wasn't dramatic, just a quiet ending of something that had stopped working. She's figuring out who she is outside of being someone's wife, outside of accommodating and adjusting. She tells me she's lonely sometimes, but also freer than she's been in years. She's dating casually, refusing to settle, learning her worth. Brandon is still in Ohio, still working at the legal aid clinic. According to Diane, he's in a relationship with the woman he mentioned, someone named Maria who knew him only as the person he became after the breakdown, not the person he was before. Diane says he seems lighter somehow. Still fragile, still in therapy, but building something real for the first time in his adult life. Diane and I talk every few months. We've become unlikely friends, bonded by the shared experience of watching our children survive their own worst impulses. She tells me stories about Brandon's childhood, and I tell her stories about raising daughters alone. We've both learned that parenting doesn't end just because your kids grow up. The consequences of how we raised them echo for decades. And me? I'm still here, still in the house Daniel and I bought in 1987, still gardening and taking watercolor classes and living my quiet life. But something's different now. I'm different. I'm no longer invisible. Not because I changed my clothes or my appearance, though I do put more effort in now, for myself rather than for others. I'm visible because I refuse to shrink anymore. Because I learned that the respect of others matters less than self-respect. Because I finally understood that being accommodating and being doormat aren't the same thing. I still think about that day sometimes. About the moment I stood up at Thanksgiving dinner and refused to accept Brandon's cruelty. About watching his confidence crumble when someone finally called out the performance he'd been giving. About the destruction that followed and whether I'm responsible for it. My therapist, yes, I started seeing someone too after everything happened, says I'm not responsible for Brandon's breakdown. That he was already heading toward that cliff, and I just happened to be the person standing there when he went over. That his fragility wasn't my fault, and neither was his cruelty. I mostly believe her. On good days, I believe her completely. On bad days, I wonder if I could have done it differently. If there was a way to protect my daughter and teach Brandon a lesson without causing so much damage. But then I remember, the damage was already there. I didn't create it. I just made it visible. Last week, I got an unexpected package in the mail. Inside was a framed photograph, one of Brandon's mother and father from decades ago, standing in front of their modest house, smiling despite everything. And a note from Brandon. Eleanor. I found this photo while cleaning out some boxes at my mom's house. It's my parents on the day they bought their house, the house I grew up in, the house I spent years being ashamed of. I'm sending it to you because I think you'd understand what it represents better than most people. These are two people who had nothing but gave everything. Who worked hard and loved their kids and never pretended to be anything other than what they were. Who had dignity without performance, worth without wealth. I look at this photo now and I see everything I spent decades running from. But I also see everything I want to become, authentic, grounded, comfortable with who I am and where I came from. You were right about me. About all of it. I was a relic too, not in the way I meant when I said it about you, but in the sense that I was stuck in an outdated version of success. One where worth was measured in status symbols and professional achievements and the ability to make others feel inferior. I'm learning a different version now. One where worth comes from usefulness, from kindness, from showing up honestly even when it's uncomfortable. It's harder than the old way, but it's real. And real is what I needed all along. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that the lesson took. That what you did, painful as it was, changed my life. Maybe saved it. I hope you're well. I hope your daughters are well. And I hope you know that you didn't destroy me. You demolished a false self I'd built, yes. But underneath that demolition, I'm finding someone worth being. Someone I can actually live with. Thank you for refusing to be small. For showing me what authenticity looks like. For loving your daughter enough to fight for her, even when it meant becoming the villain in my story. You're not a relic. You're a force. And the world needs more people like you, people who refuse to accept cruelty disguised as jokes, who stand up even when it's uncomfortable, who choose truth over peace. With respect and gratitude. Brandon. I read the letter 3 times, then called Catherine. He sent me a letter, I told her. Brandon. A real one. An honest one. How do you feel about that? She asked. I could hear her therapist's influence in the question, the careful neutrality, the invitation to examine my emotions without judgment. Complicated, I said. Glad he's healing. Still sad about what it took to get him there. Relieved that maybe it wasn't all destruction after all. Do you regret it? Any of it? I thought about that carefully. About the chain of events that had started with a cardigan and a cruel comment. About the marriages that ended and the breakdowns that happened and the therapy bills and the tears and the reconstruction that was still ongoing for all of us. No, I said finally. I don't regret it. I wish it hadn't been necessary. I wish Brandon had been capable of treating people with respect without having to be demolished first. I wish you'd never married someone who made you feel small. I wish a lot of things. But I don't regret standing up for myself. I don't regret showing you what it looks like to refuse to be diminished. Good, Catherine said firmly. Because you taught me something I'll carry for the rest of my life. That being kind doesn't mean accepting cruelty. That keeping the peace isn't worth losing yourself. That sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst behavior, even if that refusal breaks things. After we hung up, I sat with Brandon's letter for a long time. Then I did something I hadn't done before. I wrote back. Brandon. Thank you for your letter and for the photograph. Your parents look happy. The kind of happy that comes from knowing who you are and being at peace with it. You're right that they had something worth honoring, not hiding. I'm glad you're finding your way to authenticity. It's harder than performance, but it's also more sustainable. You can't maintain a false self forever. Eventually it collapses under its own weight. Better to build something real, even if it's smaller and less impressive than the illusion. I want you to know something. I didn't set out to destroy you. I set out to protect my daughter and to refuse to accept being treated as less than. But I underestimated how fragile your foundation was. I thought I was deflating an ego, not demolishing her entire identity. If I'd known how close you were to breakdown, I might have approached it differently. Or maybe not. Sometimes demolition is necessary before reconstruction. Sometimes we have to lose everything we thought we were before we can discover who we actually are. You asked about forgiveness. I'm not sure that's mine to give. You didn't wrong me so much as reveal who you were, and I responded to that revelation. The person who needs to forgive you is Catherine, and yourself. The latter might be harder than the former. But I will say this, I don't hate you. I never did. I saw you clearly, perhaps more clearly than anyone had in years, and I refuse to pretend I didn't see. That's not hatred. That's honesty. I hope you continue to build something real. I hope Maria sees you for who you're becoming, not who you were. I hope you find peace with your past and purpose in your present. And I hope you've learned what I had to learn the hard way, that the opinion that matters most is your own. Not the carefully curated version you perform for others, but the quiet, honest assessment you give yourself when no one else is watching. Be well, Brandon. Be honest. Be kind, to others, yes, but also to yourself. Eleanor. I mailed the letter the next day. I don't know if it helped him, but it helped me. It gave me closure, not on what happened, but on what it meant. It let me release the guilt I'd been carrying about his breakdown while still honoring the necessity of what I'd done. Because here's the truth I've finally accepted. I didn't destroy Brandon Mitchell. He'd already destroyed himself years ago when he decided that who he actually was wasn't good enough. When he built an entire identity on running from shame and fear and the truth of his origins. I just happened to be the person who stopped pretending not to see. Who refused to play along with the performance. Who said out loud what everyone else was too polite or too uncomfortable to say. And yes, that revelation broke him. But maybe breaking was what he needed. Maybe it was the only way he could start to heal. Maybe some structures have to fall before something better can be built in their place. I think about that a lot now, about destruction and creation, about how they're not opposites but partners. About how sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's self-destruction, even if that refusal looks like cruelty from the outside. I also think about visibility and invisibility, about how society teaches older women to fade into the background, to accept being dismissed and overlooked. About how I'd internalized that invisibility until the day I decided I'd had enough. Brandon called me a relic, and in doing so, he gave me a gift he never intended. He reminded me that I was still here. Still alive. Still capable of taking up space and demanding respect and refusing to be small. His confidence vanished the moment someone refused to accept his performance. And in that vanishing, in that moment of vulnerability and breakdown, he finally had the opportunity to build something real. I don't know if he'll succeed. I don't know if any of us will, if Catherine's second marriage will last, if Jessica will find happiness after divorce, if I'll figure out how to live the rest of my life with dignity and purpose and authenticity. But I know this, we're all trying. We're all learning. We're all figuring out how to carry our damage with grace, how to forgive ourselves for not being perfect, how to build lives that are real rather than impressive. And that seems like enough. Not a happy ending, because life doesn't have endings, just chapters that close and new ones that begin. But an honest one. A real one. One where everyone is learning to stop performing and start living. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, thank you. Thank you for listening to an older woman talk about pain and revenge and the messy, complicated truth of human relationships. Thank you for not dismissing me the way Brandon did, the way society teaches people to dismiss women like me. If you've ever been disrespected, if you've ever been told you don't matter, if you've ever been made to feel small by someone who needed you to be small so they could feel big, I hope this story gives you permission to stand tall. To claim space. To refuse to be diminished. And if you're someone who recognizes yourself in Brandon, who realizes you've been performing rather than living, hiding rather than being honest, I hope this story gives you permission to stop. To demolish whatever false self you've built. To discover who you actually are underneath the performance. It won't be easy. Nothing worth doing ever is. But it will be real. And real is always better than impressive. Check the description box below for more stories like this one. Stories about people who refused to stay silent, who chose truth over comfort, who learned that being authentic is harder than performing but infinitely more sustainable. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I'm 65 years old now. I'm a mother, a grandmother, a retired teacher, a terrible painter, a decent gardener, and someone who once gave a lesson that changed multiple lives in ways I never expected. I'm also, apparently, a relic. But I've learned that relics have value precisely because they've survived. They carry history. They tell stories. They remind us of where we've been so we can better understand where we're going. And if that makes me old-fashioned, outdated, irrelevant, so be it. I'd rather be an authentic relic than a polished lie. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And remember, you matter. Your dignity matters. Your truth matters. Never let anyone convince you otherwise.